Hello there, welcome to the Saraway channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so glad you've joined me for part 3 of our story tonight. And what an amazing story this is. It's got me on the edge of my toes, and I don't know about you. So let's continue with this story, but before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with part 3 of part 3 of tonight's story, shall we?
So tell me about yourself, Babs. Is Babs your real name? I kind of like it. It's got a nice ring to it.
No, my real name is Barbara, actually. But you know what people are like. They always tend to shorten your name, don't they? I can't remember anybody calling me Barbara for that matter. I've got so used to being called Babs. I think if someone was to call me Barbara, I wouldn't even realise they were talking to me.
You're definitely not a Barbara. Babs definitely suits you. I like it very much.
Thanks, said Babs.
So what do you do, Babs? I get the feeling you're a university student. Am I right or am I right? I can pick up on these things easily, you know. I'm quite astute, really.
Got it in a nutshell. I'm a university student. Guess what I'm studying?
Max chuckled. That's putting me on the spot, is it not? I'm not very good at guessing what people do.
Well, it was obvious to you I was a university student, so I wanted to see if it was obvious what I was studying.
You've got me, said Max. I'm not exactly sure.
I'm studying medicine, if you must know. I want to become a paediatrician, as I've always loved children. So much so, in fact, that I was torn between being a kindergarten teacher or a doctor, and I couldn't decide. So what I did was I threw a dice, and well, the dice landed on a 6, and that 6 meant that I should study medicine. So that's exactly what I did.
Max whistled. You threw a dice over whether to become a kindergarten teacher or a doctor? They're very different things, you do realise that.
Of course I realised that, which was why I threw the dice in the first place. Of course, everybody thought I was completely crazy doing that. But sometimes when you're struggling to make a decision, you need a little help, don't you? Anyway, I don't regret going into medicine. Veronica's also studying medicine, so we're at university together, which is pretty cool.
My ex-girlfriend Nicola was studying to become a doctor as well, he said wistfully. Her name's Nicola Penbridge, but she would be a year above you. You don't know her by any chance, do you? It's a small world if you do, that's for sure.
No, I'm sorry I don't know her, but I must admit the name Penbridge does ring a bell. It's a small world, you're right. How long were you together? Asked Babs. Well, that's if you don't mind me asking.
Of course I don't mind your asking. 3 years, to be exact, said Max, sounding almost sorrowful. You know, I thought she was the one, but it seems it just wasn't meant to be.
Babs felt as if she was speaking to a kindred spirit, someone who'd been through the same grief of breakup, so she could emphasise with Max's melancholia. Do you mind me asking you, Max, why things ended between you and your girlfriend? Or is that too personal? She asked, wondering why she'd been so bold to ask such a deeply personal question. But the words had come out before she'd been able to rein them in. Max studied her for a brief moment, and she was absolutely certain she'd seen anger in his eyes. Was she mistaken about that? Or had she come across as far too nosy, and he wasn't pleased about that?
Then he said, The evil bitch! That's what Nicola was, an absolute bitch! She told me it was over between us. Just like that. Can you believe it? She wouldn't give me a reason. It's one thing to break up with someone, isn't it? But when you give no explanation as to why you're ending things, it sucks, he said, slamming his beer furiously onto the camping chair. And the beer erupted into a fountain of white fizz, spilling all over the front of Max's green golfing shirt. Damn! Look what I've done to myself! Babs sat upright with a start, not expecting this seemingly nice gentleman to begin to rant about his ex-girlfriend like this, by calling her a bitch. That wasn't a nice thing to do, and Babs loathed swearing of any kind.
It offended her. It would seem asking Max about his ex-girlfriend had been the wrong thing for her to do. It appeared to have fired him up, and Max became more and more angry. Throwing a few empty beer cans that had accumulated at his feet, he gathered them up, crumpling them into balls, and began throwing them towards the lake, where they landed on the pebbly beach. Babs sincerely hoped he was going to pick up the mess he'd created. She certainly didn't want any of those tin cans to harm any of the fish or bird life at the lake. Babs could tell that Max had quite suddenly become inebriated. He was talking about his ex-girlfriend Nicola, and that appeared to have sent him right over the edge.
She was such a bitch, Nicola was. A bitch! An absolute bitch! Why the hell did she dump me like that? What did I ever do to her?
He said, raising his voice in indignation.
Do you know, she didn't tell me why she was ending things. He repeated again. She gave me no explanation. No explanation. Did you hear that? No explanation. She said it wasn't working out. Can you believe that? What's that supposed to mean? What's not working out supposed to mean?
I'm really sorry to hear that, said Babs. You know, relationships, they're very complicated. Look, it's getting very late, she said hurriedly, desperate to make herself scarce, as she felt very uncomfortable being around Max all of a sudden, especially while he was in such a cantankerous mood. I think I better be going. Thanks for the food, Max. It was absolutely delicious. I really enjoyed myself. Max charged towards her as she rose up from her camping chair.
But you can't go. Stay a little longer, will you?
He said almost pleadingly.
Look, I've got some chocolate graham crackers, marshmallows. We can make s'mores. I know every woman loves s'mores. Nicola did.
That's so nice of you to offer, and it sounds really lovely, very tempting, said Babs, her heart now pounding in her chest, because Max seemed all the more fired up, and he was giving her an intense look that was beginning to scare the bejesus out of her. She trembled awkwardly as she tried to make her excuses as best as she could. I really need to be going back to my tent. You know what? I'm suddenly so tired. It's been such a long day. Veronica will be back in any second. But it was lovely sharing your food, Max. It was nice to meet you as well. I really enjoyed myself.
You're fobbing me off, aren't you? That's what this is about. I'm not an idiot, you know.
Don't be ridiculous. Of course I'm not fobbing you off. As I was saying, I'm just very tired. I need to get back to my tent. Thanks for the lovely meal. You made the best spatchcock chicken I've ever tasted.
Don't go, please don't go,
said Max with pathetically pleading puppy dog-like eyes.
We were just beginning to have fun, weren't we? And I was enjoying myself in your company. I really like you, Babs. You're a beautiful woman, but then I'm sure everybody tells you that.
Well, it's very kind of you to say so, Max, but I really need to go, said Babs. Thanks for everything all the same. It's been such a lovely evening. Max grabbed her by the arm, squeezing her tightly, and then thrust his lips upon her. He smelt of beer, and was telling her how beautiful she was. Babs began to panic. Surely she'd not been given Max the wrong signals. Please, Max, stop. Don't. I'm not interested. If you must know, I'm involved with someone. It's not that it's you. It's not you. Of course it's not you. It's just I've got a boyfriend, she said, pushing Max away from her and trying to scurry away. But Max grabbed her and was now almost forcing himself upon her, pushing his lips onto hers. So much so that his teeth grazed her lips and blood began to trickle down her chin. She screamed out, "Stop it, Max! Stop what you're doing! Leave me alone! You're drunk! You don't know what you're doing!"
You bitch! You bitch! Said Max furiously. I'm going to get you for this.
And then to her astonishment he grabbed his hunting rifle and deliberately fired some bullets towards the lake. So they went shooting right past her. He began to laugh manically. Max grinned, holding the rifle in his hand and staring down at Babs.
Don't look so shocked. I wasn't going to kill you. I was firing my bullets at the lake. Now are you going to behave, Babs, so we can have a nice evening together? Or are you going to start playing up? I told you, I want you to stay.
Max looked down at his hands that were still clutching his rifle, as if he was challenging Babs to refuse him. Babs felt as if she was stuck between a rock and a hard place. If she turned down Max's amorous advances, he might start firing his rifle at her. On first appearances she had thought he seemed like an all-round decent gentleman, but now he seemed so unhinged, so dangerous. What was she to do? I mean, the way he was firing his rifle at the lake had been deeply troubling. What if he started firing at her? Babs gritted her teeth together uncomfortably, trying desperately to compose herself so that Max could not see the fear rising up in her eyes. I've got to go, Max, she said. She had been a fool to accept his invitation for a bite to eat. He had wanted more from her than she was prepared to give, especially after over-consuming way too many beers. Now he was incensed with Babs, especially since she was turning him down. How could she get out of this delicate, rather awkward situation without rubbing him up the wrong way? She was witnessing the same manic look she had once seen on her father, on the very evening he'd drunk far too much, and had gone charging after her mother, like a bull in a china shop. That had been the only time in Babs's life that she'd ever been scared of her father, for the alcohol had turned him into a raging lunatic, a man she didn't recognize. I need to get away from here, she thought. If I go back to the tent, well, Max could come after me, couldn't he? And then I'd have no way of escape. But if I ran through the trees, maybe I could hide out somewhere until Veronica returns to the campground. And hopefully, by then, Max will have passed out from all the drink. Look, Max, I've got a boyfriend, she said as politely as she could. I can't get involved with anybody else. I can't possibly betray his trust. That would be wrong. I'm sure you appreciate that. I need to go. Max began to fire his rifle towards the lake, the noise of his bullets making Babs begin to shake, and her ears ring from the clamorous sound. There was a murderous expression on Max's face. You bitch! You're rejecting me like Nicola did! You'll pay for this! He said, turning around to stare at Babs. Then in a matter-of-fact tone of voice that had become significantly slurred, he said very nonchalantly, I'll put a bullet in your head. You won't get to see another day, Babs. You think I'm joking, do you? I'm not bloody joking. Look at me. Do you think I'm joking? Babs did not think Max was joking, not for a second. The drink had gone straight to his head. He was slurring and waving around his rifle rather manically. It was terrifying to watch. He had been firing shots just randomly at the lake, but she was absolutely certain he would turn his rifle on her. She didn't doubt that for a second. As he began to reload his rifle, Babs didn't hang around for a moment longer. She knew what to do, and with her torch in her hands, she began to run, down past the camping site towards the trees, at the speed of light. She was hoping Max would be too drunk to give her chase, that he'd fall over himself and be all clumsy and ungainly on his feet, like her father had done all those years before, when he'd lost his temper with her mother over absolutely nothing. She heard Max calling after her, Run all you like, Babs. You won't escape me, woman. I'm going to get you, and when I do, I'm going to blow your brains out. Ha ha ha! Babs began to run past the edge of the lake. She took a direct path through the trees, not daring to glance back over her shoulders, not even for a second, as such an effort would take up far too much time for her. Max was thundering after her, at the speed of a freight train. Babs knew in that quintessential minute that if he caught up with her, he would definitely kill her. The man was completely off his rocker, and although he was drunk, his physical stamina did not appear to be remotely impeded by the large amount of beer he had so liberally consumed. How was that even possible? You're a bitch! That's what you are, Babs! You're a bitch! You're no different to my ex-girlfriend. You women are all the bloody same, the whole damn lot of you. I'm not going to put up with being rejected again. Never! You hear that? I'm sick of being rejected. I'm sorry, woman, but what you've done has made me very upset, and you're not going to get out of the woods alive. Run all you like.
I'll get you, bitch. You hear that? I'll get you. You'll be sorry. Very sorry. For in the morning, you'll be pushing up the daisies."
Babs had no way of knowing how long she'd been running for, or where Max was, or how far he was behind her. It was too dark for her to see clearly, and her visibility, even with her slimline torch, was grossly impeded. Sweat saturated her forehead. It poured into her eyes, causing them to sting. She couldn't cry, even though the little girl inside her wanted to do just that. But emotions could not be engaged if you were fighting for your life against a formidable foe that you couldn't actually see, but you knew was there and was gaining ground on you. Babs knew she was completely powerless, helpless against the likes of Max, who was so much stronger and faster than she was, even in his inebriated state. In the cold light of day, would Max behave like this, she wondered. She seriously doubted it, but there was clearly something not completely right about him. He certainly had a temper on him, as volatile as a box of explosives. Tonight he was after her, like a pack of hounds after a helpless little red fox. Max had a hunting rifle with him, and he had made it profoundly clear, when he caught up with her, he'd blow Babs's brains out. Babs felt as if she'd been flung headfirst into the most horrendous nightmare, so everything seemed insanely surreal. Over the years she'd watched horror movies on television with Veronica at her side, her eyes wide with terror as she got caught up into the heart of the movie, which more often than not featured some deranged lunatic waving around a machete. Sometimes the horror movies had felt so real it had been difficult to get any sleep that night. Babs's mother would tell her that watching horror movies was a foolish thing for her to do, for it would give her grievous nightmares. But never in a million years did Babs think she'd actually find herself caught up in one. The adrenaline began to charge through her system, so she had run like the wind through the lofty maze of trees on this very dark, inauspicious night, where very little moonlight spilled through the open canopy. Her slimline torch was growing dimmer by the second, as if its battery was wearing thin. And Babs did not need her light to fail her, not tonight, as she was completely dependent on it. Babs began to feel her legs losing strength. She was completely breathless, as if not enough oxygen was getting into her lungs. Her heart pounded furiously in her chest, and her whole trembling body was caught up in a typical fight and flight response. Max was closing in behind her, for although she couldn't see him yet, she could almost certainly feel his presence, and she knew he would catch up with her very soon. She had to hide. It was her only chance to survive. Her strength was definitely waning, and she knew that she couldn't run any further. She had to give up. Babs scrambled under a thorny bush of briars, her skin screaming out in agonizing pain, as it was shredded so cruelly by hundreds of barbs that ripped right through her. But even though the pain was agonizing, Babs did not feel it. She was numb to everything, including her own emotions. For if she indulged in them, she'd have crumpled up like an old piece of paper. She could only hope that Max would not look for her under a bramble bush. But surely if it was covered in thorny briars, he'd never think to look for her there, and she was banking on him making that assumption. She held her breath as tightly as she could. Blood seeped from the deep scratches in her skin, trickling down her clothes, mixing with her sweat. Then she heard Max's boots pounding over the forest floor. Oh my God, he was coming! He was coming! She could even smell him, before she even saw him. A mixture of sweat mixed with beer. She could see the fierce light of his torch breaking through the darkness like an obtrusive, all-invasive spotlight that appeared to swallow up the dark shadows as it broke its leering gaze through the trees. "Please don't see me," she inwardly cried. "Please, please don't see me." Babs lay flat on the ground, her nostrils filled with the smell of the damp earth. She held her breath, and then it happened. Babs' worst, most terrible fears were confirmed, when she heard the slur of Max's triumphant voice. "Ah, there you are. You thought I wouldn't find you. Silly woman. You underestimated me. You gave yourself away, snagged a bit of your shirt on a bramble. But big prizes for thinking of a clever place like this to hide.
If you'd been a little bit more shrewd, perhaps I wouldn't have found you. But it's too late for recriminations. Far too late. I've got you now, haven't I?"
A big hand grabbed her by the leg and yanked her out from under the bramble bush, where still more thorns ripped unapologetically through her flesh. Babs found herself lying flat on the forest floor, with a bright torchlight being thrust invasively into her face. It was so blinding that she was struggling to see the green eyes that leered down at her. They glared down at her with an expression of unbridled hatred coupled with intense loathing. Max was looking at her as if she was a cockroach that he seriously wanted to expunge by squashing with his boot or spraying with some poison spray.
"Go on! Beg for your life!"
he taunted, kicking her in the chest with his boot, so that the pain scorched through her body with a burning spasm.
"Beg for your life! You know, I've never killed a human before. I've killed deer, rabbits, coons, but never a woman. First time for everything."
He put the hunting rifle on her head and taunted her. "Please!" She sobbed. "Please! Please, Max, don't do this. I'm begging you. I'm begging you. I've got a mother and I've got family. Please, please don't do this." But Max did not listen. The next thing was that a shot sounded, and Babs's world became completely black, and it was all over for her.
"Stupid, stupid bitch,"
said Max, satisfied that the woman who had rejected him had now suffered the full consequences of her actions. He kicked her dead corpse with an expression of great disgust on his face.
"We could have had a nice evening together, but no, you had to ruin it, didn't you?"
7 years later, Shelley Fenugreek could not believe how her luck had changed. Her life was barely recognisable to the life she'd known only 3 weeks before. Who would have thought that a random trip to the doggy park, where she'd taken her grandmother's white Maltese poodle Sophie for a walk, would have resulted in her meeting the man of her dreams? Shelley had never been a big romantic, far from it in fact. She knew only too well your life didn't pan out like it did in the movies, or like some of those romantic fiction books her sister Eloise lapped up so eagerly. If the truth be told, Shelley's dogged scepticism about relationships had meant that she'd almost subconsciously repelled men, without meaning to do so, almost as if there was a keep away sign pinned on her person, for she'd always appeared to be unlucky in love, and her relationships with men never amounted to very much, nor did they go past the first trimester. They just seemed to fade away, like a sparkler that lights up suddenly. It's magnificent for a brief moment, but then it abruptly dies, its spark remembered no more. That's exactly what relationships were like for Shelley. By now her older brother Morris was a happily married man, with a 2-year-old boy called Denny, while her younger sister Eloise, the perennial romantic in the family, had got married 5 years earlier, and still appeared to be hopelessly and madly in love with her husband. And she was now expecting her first baby in a couple of months' time. It was almost as if the romantic fiction Eloise had consumed so passionately as a young girl had hardwired her to believe that life in the real world rarely was a bed of roses, and maybe having an optimistic outlook, such as hers, had served her well. As they do say, you create your own reality, and it would seem that Eloise's love life was certainly like something written in a book of romantic fiction, and even her husband was so incredibly handsome, and he seemed to play the perfect role of a romantic hero. Growing up, Shelley had laid into Eloise hard, mocking her unkindly over her obsession with romantic fiction, which she thought was far too overindulgent. In those days, Eloise could easily be found lying across her bed, her nose tucked very happily into a romantic novel. Shelley had told her sister that she was very sorry to inform her, but no tall, dark stranger was ever going to whisk her away on a big black horse and take her to his fairy tale castle in the sky. "It doesn't work like that in the real world," she had informed her sister, almost enjoying seeing the look of hurt discharge itself across Eloise's face. It had irritated Shelley profusely that her whimsically naive sister seemed to build fanciful castles in the air, with all her daydreaming. Indeed, Eloise was such a dreamer that even the teachers at the school had complained about Eloise, always seemingly to have her head in the clouds. Yet if the truth be told, Eloise and Morris had left her far behind, as if Shelley was still waiting at the bus stop for the man of her dreams to arrive. But the bus stop remained empty day after day, as if Shelley was still waiting at the bus stop for the man of her dreams to arrive. But the bus stop remained empty, as if she'd been permanently stood up. Shelley's grandparents had been responsible for raising all three of their late son's children, as both of their parents were tragically killed in a small plane crash when flying over the Kenyan wilderness to join a group of tourists who would be watching the Great Migration across the Serengeti. But it was not to be. As to why the plane had crashed, no one knew the answer to that question, and investigations appeared to be ongoing, with no answers ever found. It was after their parents' tragic deaths that the fenugreeks had taken legal guardianship of their three grandchildren. Morris was the oldest sibling, and had been 6 years old when his parents had sadly died. But even his memories of them were fleetingly vague, although at the time he'd taken the news of his parents' demise extremely badly. So for the three fenugreek children, they'd never felt the true devastation of losing their parents, for their memories of them had been at best very scant. Their grandmother, Alice Fenugreek, had done everything in her power to keep the children's memories of their parents alive, by showing them photographs and telling them stories. But when Shelley had turned around one day and said very candidly to her grandmother, "We don't remember our parents, Granny Alice. You and Grandpa Bobby have always been our parents to us," it was then that Alice realised that trying to bring the dead back to life as far as her grandchildren were concerned was never ever going to work. All three of Alice Fenugreek's grandchildren could not have been more different. Morris had always been the sensible, pragmatic one. He'd always been sports-orientated and was brilliant at school, excelling in all his grades. He had grown up with a passion for animals, most especially the indigenous wildlife native to the Americas. In so many ways, Morris rather reminded Alice of her son that she had lost so tragically in that small plane crash. It would seem the older that Morris became, the more he reminded Alice of her late son. Now that Morris had left home and was married with a child, he had become a very successful veterinary surgeon, with a special interest in wild animals, and as a consequence, the young family were living close to Mount Rainier, where there was an abundance of wildlife. So many injured animals were brought to him, and money raised by an animal charity was used to help the treatment of the natural wildlife in the area. Alice Fenugreek's youngest granddaughter Eloise, who had always been a delightful child growing up, with a wild, fanciful imagination that Alice had always found rather endearing. Growing up, Eloise had been such a feminine child. She had loved to dress up in her grandmother's clothes, and study her reflection at great length in the mirror, long and hard. She'd plaster her face with lipstick, drape herself in her grandmother's pearls and beady necklaces, and place her tiny feet into her grandmother's high wedge heels, and she'd stagger around the place, tripping over the hems of her grandmother's long dresses. As Eloise got significantly older, she became passionate about fashion, and was very skilled with a sewing machine, making all her own dresses, where she'd brought Victorian clothes into the 21st century with an avant-garde flair. Eloise was now as a consequence running a fashion boutique in Seattle, where she sold some of her amazing creations to a very affluent clientele with a select taste. For as long as Alice could remember, her granddaughter had been passionate about romantic historic fiction. Sometimes her obnoxious sister Shelley would tease her tirelessly about this, because she would tell her over and over again that the world was not made out of cotton candy. At the time, Alice Fenugreek had privately thought Shelley was absolutely right, and that one day Eloise's heart would be badly broken, and she'd get a rude awakening when her first relationship blew apart. Eloise had surprised them all. She had come home one day from town with a huge smile on her face, announcing that she had met her Prince Charming, and that he was no doubt in her mind the one for her. I was sitting there in the coffee shop, having a hazelnut latte, would you believe? She told her grandmother. And lo and behold, this really handsome man comes up to me, Granny, and he told me I had such a beautiful smile. Can you believe that? He was ever so nice to me. A perfect gentleman he was, and so well spoken. He asked if he could buy me another hazelnut latte. So I said, why not? We talked for ages, Granny. He's the one for me. I'm telling you, he's the man I'm going to marry. I knew it the moment I saw him. I'm going to see him tomorrow evening. He's picking me up for dinner. Lo and behold, Eloise's relationship with Montgomery Pearson had played out like one of the romantic pieces of fiction her granddaughter had tirelessly read, and within a year of regular dating, the couple had tied the knot and got married, and Eloise had never been happier. Granny Alice was extremely concerned about Shelley, for she was the one that seemed to be left behind, like the fledgling that refused to leave its mother's nest. Granny Alice had always believed that Shelley's scepticism was a healthy one, for it prepared her for the holes in the road along your journey in life, so that if adversity came to strike you down, you were well prepared for it. In reality, Shelley had not had any long-lasting relationships with men, and had not really found any direction in her life, almost as if she was feeling her way around the world, like a mole in the dark, and never finding the right tunnel that would lead her directly to the light. Shelley was working 3 days a week at an art gallery in town, and when she wasn't working she'd help Granny Alice around the house, for she was not in a position to leave their leafy green Seattle neighbourhood, where she resided with her grandparents, for the prices of apartment rentals were far too costly to consider leaving home. Granny Alice loved having Shelley around the place, but how she wished with all her heart her granddaughter would meet someone who would sweep her off her feet. Then it happened on an unassuming afternoon, when Shelley had been walking Granny Alice's Maltese poodle Sophie at the doggy park. It was on Shelley's walk at the park that she observed a very handsome man walking his enormous black dog. It looked to be a mixture between a Great Dane and a Labrador, although she couldn't entirely be sure what it was, but it was nevertheless enormous in size and shape, and seemed to be all legs. All of a sudden the handsome man was thrown to his feet, losing control over the lead, and the Herculean-sized dog, dragging the lead behind him, began charging ebulliently towards little Sophie, like those greyhounds on a racing track. Shelley wanted to scream, for she was sure that Sophie's life was over, and that this huge dog's monstrous jaws would be tearing the Maltese apart in any second. Sophie, sensing the size of this great monstrosity hurling towards her, began to cower nervously behind Shelley's leg, and began to whimper. And then there was the dog, greeting Sophie like a long-lost beloved friend, and covering her with big sloppy licks. Sophie stopped cowering at once, and she and the big dog began chasing each other around the park, as if they had been best buddies forever. "Oh, I'm very sorry about this," said the handsome man, coming up to Shelley with a sheepish smile on his face. "I didn't anticipate all this. I was just walking in the park, and then the next thing I'm thrown off my feet, and I lost control of the lead, I'm afraid." "What were you thinking? You should have been holding on to the lead properly. He's a huge dog. My dog was absolutely terrified." "But look at them now," said the young man. "They're all over each other, are they not? And you can see they've bonded instantaneously." "Even so, it could have been a different story, couldn't it? I mean, your dog, if you don't mind my saying so, is built like a miniature horse. He's massive. And the way he hightailed it over here was alarming. I thought he was going to tear little Sophie apart. I really did. It was a very scary event." "I must apologise for all that. He's not my dog. He belongs to my boss. I take him out for a walk often. I usually hold the lead very lightly. He's a big soppy dog, you see. Not a bad bone in his entire body. But recently Mr. Thornbriar's little white Maltese poodle passed away, I'm afraid. I hasten to say she was a dead ringer for your dog. Her name, believe it or not, was also Sophie. And I guess when Heathcliff saw your dog, he thought his best friend had returned from the dead. I mean, look how incredibly excited he is." "Are you kidding me?" said Shelley, her face expressing extreme surprise. "This is my grandmother's dog. Her name's Sophie. Shelley's face suddenly broke out into a broad grin. I think they like each other, you're right. They are bonding.
They sure are. Although I think Heathcliff thinks Sophie over there is a popsicle, don't you? He chuckled. He's licking her within an inch of his life. My name's Max, by the way. Max McKeith. And you are?
I'm Shelley, she said, finding her eyes meeting the perfect green eyes that were now making her legs wobble. This man was so extraordinarily handsome, and he was making her heart flutter, and no one had ever done that to her before. She was behaving like one of those pathetic characters in her sister's mushy novels. It was ridiculous.
How about I buy you an ice cream to make up for Heathcliff's very bad behaviour?
Said Max, pulling a funny face, which had made Shelley laugh. Good-looking and funny too. This man had it all.
I'll even buy an ice cream for Sophie, given Heathcliff has licked her within an inch of his life. How about that?
Well, now you come to mention it, an ice cream would be absolutely lovely, Shelley had said. I like vanilla bean myself, dipped in chocolate. Sophie will have the same, minus the chocolate, of course.
Well then, 2 vanilla beans coming up,
said Max, giving her a wink. She had been unable to believe how she and Max had hit it off, and much like her sister Eloise, she had had a feeling, a very strong feeling, that she had met the one. She couldn't believe she was actually feeling this way. It was an incongruous experience for her, because she was not emotionally indulgent by nature. She had prided herself in being unabashedly sceptical about love, until now. Maybe the tide had really turned for her. And if the truth be told, she'd never met anyone like Max before. They had agreed to meet up the following afternoon at the doggy park again. Shelley couldn't wait to return home to Granny Alice and to Grandpa Bobby to tell them about the extraordinary rendezvous in the park that she had had with the most handsome stranger. He's so nice, Granny. He's got the most beautiful green eyes, dark brown hair as well. I know this is crazy, and I'm sounding exactly like Eloise, and the last person I want to sound like is my sister, who I unkindly ridiculed for being such a romantic. But I think Granny Alice, Max McKeith might just be the one. I feel it in my gut, as crazy as it sounds. And it helps that he's so easy on the eye, let me tell you.
Goodness gracious me, love. I don't know what to say. You say his boss's dog Heathcliff couldn't get enough of our Sophie, and that Heathcliff lost his best friend, who was also a white Maltese called Sophie. What are the chances of that happening? I think the universe has a very big sense of humour, don't you? What do you think about this, Bobby? She said, turning to her husband. It's extraordinary, Bobby admitted, with a satisfied grin on his face. I hope it works out for you, Shelley, like it did for your brother and sister. Mind you, you haven't had the best track record with relationships, have you? Don't be so rude, love, said Granny Alice.
Granny Alice had not known what to make of her granddaughter's story. She should have been excited to hear that Shelley had finally met someone. She had been wishing that this would happen a long time ago. And judging by the romantic way the couple had met at the doggy park, their meeting seemed magically serendipitous, as if it had been divinely ordained. But something felt off for Alice, like a deep niggling feeling inside her, that hinted that this was a love story that would not have a happy ending. Why she felt this way she didn't know. And in the beginning she didn't share her doubts with her husband Bobby, because she knew he would think her gut instincts were absolutely ridiculous. And in truth they probably were. Don't be silly, Granny Alice told herself very sternly, almost as if she was chastising a small child for such rude thoughts. Why are you indulging in such pessimistic thinking like this? What is wrong with you, Alice Fenugreek? You haven't even met the young man yet, and you've already decided that there's something terribly wrong with him. Of course, Granny Alice did meet Max, when she finally invited him around for dinner one night to join the family, as she was eager to make his acquaintance, given how much Shelley had raved about him. Max McKeith had been the perfect gentleman, but Alice again could not shake off the feeling that there was something about Max she didn't like, almost as if there was a dark, insidious side to his character that he'd kept well hidden from everyone. Once again she told herself she was talking absolute nonsense. Max was absolutely perfect for Shelley, in every possible way. And it was blindingly obvious that they were both head over heels in love with each other. Why could she not be happy for her granddaughter, like she had been happy and delighted for both Maurice and Eloise? It would seem Alice's niggling doubts would not abate, and there were nights she would dream of her granddaughter lying in an open grave, with Max hovering above it with a spade, looking down on her granddaughter's deceased corpse with a manic, almost deranged grin on his face. Alice Fenugreek had never had lucid dreams such as this before, but when she shared the troubling dream with her husband, he told her she was having a nightmare, and that her dream had meant absolutely nothing. Alice, of course, was not so sure, and felt a horrible sense of dis-ease, almost as if the dream was some kind of prognostication that she was loath to do anything about, unless, of course, she wanted to alienate her beloved granddaughter, who seemed to think that pink cherry blossoms grew out of Max McKeith's backside. She wouldn't have had a bad word said against him. Within weeks, Alice was alarmed to see that the relationship between her granddaughter and her new boyfriend had grown very strongly. And then one day Shelley returned home, wearing a big sapphire and diamond engagement ring, along with a huge smile on her face that told it all. She announced very proudly to her grandparents that she was engaged, and Alice had pretended to be thrilled for her, as what else could she do? Grandpa Bobby rarely liked Max when he'd first met him, and thought Shelley and Max made a great couple. He couldn't understand why his wife had nursed misgivings over him, just because of a silly nightmare she had had, which had meant nothing. But he thought that maybe Alice didn't want her remaining grandchild leaving home for good. "That must be what this is all about," he concluded to himself. "The house will become very lonely without our grandchild around, and it will be tough for my Alice." "I'm very happy for you, Shelley. It's about time the man popped the question," said Grandpa Bobby. "I've been waiting for some good man like Max to sweep you off your feet," he said, throwing his arms around Shelley and enveloping her in a big hug. "Isn't this wonderful news, Alice?" he said, turning to look at his wife. Alice's expression appeared to be vacant. Her face had grown pale, and there was a far-away, distant look in her eyes that seemed almost melancholic. "Love, you're away with the fairies," he said, waving his hands in front of his wife's eyes, as if to bring her back to reality. "I was saying, love, isn't this wonderful news for Shelley? That she's engaged, I mean." "Oh, of course it's wonderful news," said Alice, seemingly to suddenly come out of her trance. She gave her granddaughter a half-hearted smile, but the smile refused to meet her eyes. Her heart was aflutter with trepidation, for something in her had warned her that this engagement was not good news, but she knew she had to keep such thoughts all to herself. "Just so you know, Granny, I won't be here over the weekend," said Shelley excitedly. "I'm going to the Mount Rainier area with Max. He's taking me to his favourite camping ground there. It's a place called Lakefield Camping Ground, which he frequented a lot as a child. He said it's absolutely amazing. It's privately owned. Not many people know about the place. There's a beautiful lake there, alpine fields of flowers, groves of evergreen trees, walking trails, and incredible views over Mount Rainier itself." "Are you going to look in on your brother Maurice, given you're going to the Mount Rainier area? Maurice lives there, you know. I'm sure he and his wife would be delighted to see the both of you. You could introduce them to Max, couldn't you, then?" "No, I don't think there'll be any time for any of that. I'll look in on Maurice another time, perhaps." Alice Fenugreek really wanted to be happy for her granddaughter, being engaged to such a handsome man who was taking her to the mountains. She involuntarily grabbed her granddaughter by the arm, in an impromptu moment of impulse, as a shiver of dread ran down her spine. She squeezed her granddaughter's arm so tightly, so much so that Shelley quickly retracted her arm. "Ouch, Granny! That hurt!" "Oh, I'm so sorry, love." "What is it, Granny?" she said, looking up at her grandmother in surprise. "You don't seem happy about my engagement to Max. I thought you'd be delighted when all three of your grandchildren are happily settled down. Why do I get the funny impression you don't like Max? He's the whole package, Granny. But I don't think you've ever warmed to him, not even a little. I'm not blind, Granny. I saw the funny look you gave him. Of course I'm happy for you, love. I'm concerned this relationship with Max, well, it's been a little whirlwind. Well, it's been fast, hasn't it? A whirlwind romance, perhaps. And now you're engaged. Everything's happening very fast. I would have expected this from your sister Eloise, but not from the likes of you. You've always been the one that's so astute, so level-headed. I thought you would date the man for a long time, a couple of years perhaps, before you tied the knot. In my opinion, that would have been a wise decision for you to make. Rushing into things like this can be a dreadful mistake. This has been so terribly fast. I'm just saying, love, you need to be careful, that's all. But, Granny, I love Max. I knew the moment I met him he was the one, just like Eloise did when she met her husband. It worked out for her. Why shouldn't it work out for me? Can't you be happy for me, Granny? Don't mind me, love. Don't listen to a word I say. I'm an old lady that doesn't know what she's talking about. My problem is I'm far too overprotective over my grandchildren. I just want the very best for you, that's all. I hope you have a wonderful time at the campground, celebrating your engagement. If you're happy, love, then so am I. That's all I can ever ask for. That's all I want for my grandchild, is for her to be fulfilled and happy with her life. And if Max ticks all your boxes, then who am I to complain? So there we are. That is the end of part 3 of our story. Part 4 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.